Hello from Toronto, Canada, to our friends in Argentina. Je me llamo Matthew Forche. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Institute of Corporate Directors in Canada, and with me today is Rahul Bhardwaj, the CEO of the ICD. So Rahul, the conference today is about the good board member beyond compliance. So let's start with that. Let's talk about compliance a little bit and maybe talk about where it fits in board responsibilities here in Canada and maybe North America, and maybe a little bit about how boards have moved beyond compliance here.
That's a great question. And people often ask, is the compliance burden of a board increasing or decreasing? Well, I can think safely, it's certainly not going to be going down, particularly if you're in a regulated environment, depending on the nature of the organization. But I think it's also fair to say that compliance is table stakes, as we would say, for boards. So it's a must-do, not a nice-to-do. But compliance should not be confused with leadership.
That's right.
It's the beginning of the conversation, but it's certainly not the end of the conversation.
So I want to talk about leadership in a bit, but before we move past compliance, maybe we'll talk a little bit about your experience as a board director and as obviously the leader of board directors here in Canada. Where does compliance fit within a typical board here in Canada?
Sure. So from a structural standpoint, first of all, it depends on the nature of the industry, the nature of the business. If it's a highly regulated industry, you're going to have more focus on compliance. There's obviously regulation. But then it depends on the nature of it. So if it's technology compliance, it may be in a technology committee. It could be in the audit committee. It could be in the risk committee. If it's labor compliance, you might find it in what we call the HRCC, the Human Resources and Compensation Committee. So it's quite functional, I would say.
And as you say, of course, different industries demand different levels of compliance observance. So here in Canada, highly regulated industries, financial services are very important here, as are extraction industries, oil and gas, mining, all heavily regulated here in Canada, a little bit different than some other places in the world. Our economy is structured a little bit differently. So, as you said, table stakes, that's what compliance is here in Canada. A typical board director here, I think, is waking up to the idea that they're leaders. They are leaders not only in their organizations, but in their societies as well. You go around the world and you talk about leadership and how board directors can be changing conversations and leading conversations. Maybe do you want to talk a little bit about how boards in Canada and elsewhere can really be shaping not only conversations but policy?
That's a great point, because I think the nature and role of boards, not only the responsibility, but the opportunity is growing dramatically. So it's not unusual for a board looking back 20, 25 years ago to feel fairly comfortable and safe in the environment of looking at compliance. But now we're seeing that the threat to industries, to companies, and of course to economies is being shaped by global events. So 25 years ago, issues around cybersecurity or digital transformation or disruption, or if we consider the geopolitical events that are impacting economies and companies today, well, these are issues that have direct strategic impact on companies. Therefore, it is the responsibility of a director to be engaged with those and to demonstrate leadership in there. So once upon a time, as they would say, directors would be focusing on making sure you're simply enhancing shareholder value, you're keeping the regulators happy, and you have oversight over management. That's expanded a lot more. It's got a lot more complex.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great point. So in Canada, we have a bit of a different framework where boards of directors need to think a little bit more about stakeholders beyond shareholders, and that's not the case everywhere in the world. And of course, globally, you see in the U.S. CEOs talking about the purpose of the company beyond just making money. And I think a lot of people would agree intellectually with that, but the reality is not that in a lot of places. In Canada, that is a little bit more the reality, and I wonder if you've got some thoughts around how boards of directors should be thinking about the purpose of their company and what they can do to add value beyond just shareholder value.
It's nice to see that conversation starting to pick up, as they say, the pace around the world. In some ways, I say with a smile that much of the world is catching up to a place that Canada has been for a while. So as you know, our Supreme Court, through our BCE case, has already said that directors, in fulfilling their fiduciary obligation, may look at the interests beyond just shareholders to other stakeholders. could be employees, it could be communities, but other stakeholders are relevant to the considerations of boards, whether it be in a mergers and acquisition environment, capital allocation, or employee relationships. They can look beyond that. And this is in fact very much in tune with a lot of the conversations that are generating around the existential question for an organization. What is its purpose? Many companies were comfortable having a vision and a mission, but we know now that society is looking at companies and they're saying, we need you to have a purpose. We need you to actually be contributing not only to the economy, but to the country, not solely focusing on enhancing shareholder wealth. And this has some quite dramatic implications potentially to the role of the director and the very notion of what the corporation exists for.
Yeah, and you know, stakeholders here in Canada, I think it's true everywhere else in the world, can also mean the environment. It can be mean Indigenous communities, and you know, having to show that you are mindful of their priorities and their concerns is an important sort of wrinkle here in Canada. But I think when it comes to leadership and it comes to sort of directing you know, the future of the organization, most people, at least most people who don't live in the world of corporate governance, would say, well, that's the role of the CEO. That's the senior manager's job. The board just has to sort of ensure that the CEO doesn't go too far to one side or the other. Just keep them in their lane, make sure they're compensated appropriately, and you know, just step away. That's not really how we see the world.
And this is interesting. There is an orthodoxy of corporate governance that says precisely that. Management's responsible for the operations. A good board, smart thing, hire the right CEO, have some oversight, and then get out of the way and let them do that. And even at the management level, we see there's the management, which is doing things right, and the leadership component, which is doing the right things. Yeah. And the board needs to be engaged in that conversation. They're responsible for capital allocation, whether it be through mergers and acquisitions or research and development, or mostly oversight and approval of strategy. Right. But the nexus between those, because it's getting so complex in the environment out there, has to be much tighter. And as you recall, in our director's education program, as we teach through the ICD, we talk about hindsight, oversight, and foresight being the lenses that directors need to bring to their enterprise. And this is another way of saying that it's so critical that boards have not only oversight of management, an oversight of strategy, but in this complex environment where you need diversity on a board, and I mean diversity of skills in particular and perspectives, whether it be a digital lens or perhaps a climate lens or an Indigenous lens, or even more importantly, I would say a global lens that you can bring to your board. It's not just enough to have those perspectives around the board table, but you have to learn to include those perspectives in it. And that creates a very dynamic environment where governance is not there just to protect and comply, but it's there to enable the companies to innovate and to grow and to generate wealth, not just for the shareholders apparently, but much more broadly.
I wonder if you've got some thoughts around some of the upcoming issues here in Canada that are really sort of top of mind for directors. We survey our members, obviously, and they consistently come back with cybersecurity being a top of mind issue. This is a real concern for them. But you know, they're really concerned also about sustainability. They're concerned about culture and how they oversee that. What would you say are the top of mind issues?
Yeah, so, well, you've laid out a couple of them, which I think are very important. And ESG, so environmental, social governance, becoming enormously important for companies right now. And you marry that with culture as well, because as many will know, that the old saying is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And we've seen a number of instances where poor culture, and you think of #MeToo, has harmed the reputation and the value generated by companies. It's created walls where you can't attract talent in a time where you absolutely must attract talent. And above all, trust amongst your consumers and amongst the social license environment that you're existing within. But even more so, as these strategies are shifting so quickly to address global changes, whether it be climate change, particularly tariffs, political change, trading alliances, having the right culture to actually drive that strategy is no small feat. And what's the board oversight of culture when the board needs to be able to measure things? These are new advances in corporate governance that we're seeing our directors developing new processes and methodologies to address these new changes. And of course, we're in a country that's just gone through an election. We're seeing regional differences. We're seeing transition to a new type of economy. And all of this is not only stressing the populations, but it's stressing management, companies, and of course, boards. How are they to enable their companies to respond to all of these in a productive fashion?
One of the messages that you've brought across the country and around the world is the idea that good corporate governance can be a competitive advantage, and not just for companies, but for countries. And we think that that is the case here in Canada. We're relatively proud of our corporate governance. It's not perfect. There are a lot of things that we can do to improve it. But at the end of the day, what we say is, if you're going to park your money somewhere, if you're going to send some of your best people, Canada's a good choice. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see corporate governance being a competitive advantage, and what others could learn from those countries that have seem to be doing it right.
That's a great question, because at the very heart of corporate governance, its lifeblood is trust. And not surprisingly, trust is what we've made our purpose at the Institute of Corporate Directors in Canada as well. We're here to build trust and confidence in Canadian organizations, and how we do it is by developing and activating directors. So we believe there's a direct, straight line connection between good board leadership and good corporate governance, building trust, not only for the company, but also to build national outcomes. And you alluded to them, it's about trust in placing capital, about placing your future in a company. It's about trust from your consumers, trust from your investors, trust from your regulators. All of this is extraordinarily cumulative as well. And in the absence of trust, just look at those countries and those companies that are struggling on the trust meter. And we'll see that that is having a negative impact on the economies, a negative impact on their optimism about the future, and their negative impact on their ability to really not only manage the risks of globalizations, but really harness those opportunities in globalization as well. So it's all about trust. So making corporate governance your global competitive advantage is really flying a big flag up that says you can trust us.
I think we probably have to wrap it up now, but I want to thank our friends in Argentina for the opportunity to speak with you. Gracias, and have a great conference.